Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable people become when left alone with their thoughts? How they reach for their phones the moment silence descends? How they fill every empty moment with noise, distraction, or mindless activity? It's not just habit, it's fear. A fear so deep and primal that most never recognize it. The fear of confronting what lies beneath when all distractions are stripped away. Schopenhauer, one of history's most penetrating philosophers, understood something profound about boredom that most of us miss. He didn't see it as merely an unpleasant state to be avoided, but as a mirror reflecting our innermost reality, a window into who we truly are. But why would something as seemingly trivial as boredom reveal our essence? What makes this ordinary experience so profoundly revealing? The answer lies in what happens when the noise stops, when distractions fall away, when we're forced to confront the emptiness that many spend their entire lives running from. Think about it. In a world designed for constant stimulation, boredom has become almost extinct. Yet paradoxically, more people than ever feel empty inside. This is not coincidence, it's causation. To understand this phenomenon, we must first recognize what boredom actually is. Most people misinterpret boredom as simply the absence of stimulation, but Schopenhauer saw it differently. He recognized boredom as the painful awareness of emptiness when our distractions fail us, when we're forced to confront the fundamental reality of our existence without the buffer of entertainment or activity. The two enemies of human happiness are pain and boredom, Schopenhauer wrote. At first glance, this pairing seems strange. Why would he place boredom alongside pain as life's greatest adversary? Because while pain attacks from the outside, boredom reveals the void within, and for many, that internal emptiness is far more terrifying than external suffering. Consider how modern society operates. We've created an entire culture dedicated to avoiding boredom at all costs. Streaming services promise endless entertainment. Social media delivers dopamine hits with every scroll. Smartphones ensure we're never without distraction. The modern world has weaponized convenience against introspection. But why this desperate flight from silence? Why the panic that sets in when we're left alone with our thoughts? The answer reveals a psychological truth most people spend their lives avoiding. Boredom unmasks who we really are when no one is watching and nothing is happening. Studies at the University of Virginia found something shocking. Participants preferred administering painful electric shocks to themselves rather than sitting alone with their thoughts for just 15 minutes. Think about that. Physical pain was preferable to confronting the contents of their own minds. This isn't just preference, it's pathology, masquerading as normalcy. Schopenhauer understood this long before modern psychology. He believed that our capacity to be alone with ourselves, to face boredom without flinching, directly reflects our inner worth. A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, he wrote, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom. For it is only when he is alone that he is really free. This is where boredom becomes revelatory. When distractions vanish and we're left with only ourselves, what emerges? For some, unbearable restlessness. For others, anxiety. For many, a profound emptiness they've spent decades avoiding. But for a few, those who have developed inner resources, boredom becomes the gateway to self-discovery, creativity, and authentic existence. Consider the difference in how people respond to unexpected downtime. Those with hollow inner lives immediately reach for distraction, their phones, television, anything to fill the void. But those with rich internal worlds often welcome these moments as opportunities for reflection, imagination, or simply being. This stark contrast reveals something fundamental about who we really are. But if boredom reveals our true nature, what exactly does it reveal? Schopenhauer identified several patterns that emerge when people confront emptiness. First, boredom exposes our relationship with desire. Schopenhauer believed that human life oscillates between pain and boredom. When we desire something we don't have, we experience pain. When desire is temporarily satisfied, boredom quickly follows. Those who jump compulsively from desire to desire reveal a fundamental inability to find satisfaction in existence itself. They require constant external stimulation because internally there's not enough there. Second, boredom reveals our capacity for meaning. Those who find life meaningless when external entertainments are removed have built their existence on sand. Their sense of purpose depends entirely on distraction, consumption, or validation from others. Remove these props, and the structure collapses. True meaning, Schopenhauer believed, must withstand the test of solitude and silence. Third, boredom exposes our relationship with our own consciousness. Some people cannot bear to be alone with their thoughts because those thoughts are unbearable, filled with regret, anxiety, or existential dread. Others have cultivated minds that serve as sources of fascination and discovery. The difference isn't intelligence, but inner development, the capacity to engage with oneself as one would with a valued companion. Modern neuroscience confirms Schopenhauer's insights. When the brain's default mode network activates during boredom, it doesn't simply idle. It begins processing unresolved emotions, connecting disparate ideas, and contemplating our place in the world. For those who've never developed this capacity, this state feels intolerable. Their inner life hasn't been cultivated, so when forced inward, they find a wasteland. A 2019 study from the University of York found that people who embrace boredom without immediately seeking distraction show increased creativity, problem-solving abilities, and psychological resilience. The study concluded that boredom proneness, the tendency to experience boredom frequently, isn't the problem. The problem is boredom intolerance, the inability to stay with the feeling without escaping into distraction. But if boredom is so revealing, why do most people avoid it so desperately? The answer lies in what psychologists call experiential avoidance, the tendency to escape uncomfortable internal experiences at all costs. We avoid boredom for the same reason we avoid pain, grief, or anxiety, because facing these states requires courage. And confronting the empty spaces within ourselves may be the greatest act of courage possible. This explains why many accomplished, seemingly successful people collapse when their careers end. The executive who can't handle retirement, the athlete who self-destructs after leaving sports, the workaholic who breaks down on vacation. These aren't just adjusting to a change in routine. They're encountering their true selves without the distraction of achievement or activity, often for the first time. Schopenhauer observed that wealth is like seawater. The more we drink, the thirstier we become. The same applies to distraction. The more we consume, the greater our intolerance for emptiness grows. Each social media check, each Netflix binge, each mindless scroll makes the next moment of silence more difficult to bear. We're not just habituated to distraction, we're addicted to avoiding ourselves. What would Schopenhauer make of our modern predicament? He would likely see our technology not as progress, but as increasingly sophisticated tools for self-avoidance. Smartphones aren't just devices, they're portable escape hatches from the present moment. Social media isn't connection, it's a never-ending stream of distraction from the self. Our culture hasn't conquered boredom, it's institutionalized the fear of it. Consider how we raise children now. From infancy, they're surrounded by stimulation, screens, activities, constant entertainment. Many never experience the creative boredom that previous generations knew, the empty afternoons that led to invention, imagination, and self-discovery. Instead, they learn that emptiness is emergency, that being alone with thoughts is something to be feared rather than cultivated. Research from the University of Michigan found that since 1980, teenagers' capacity for empathy has dropped nearly 40%, while narcissism has increased by a similar margin. Is it coincidence that this shift parallels the rise of constant entertainment, or is there a deeper connection? When we never face ourselves in silence, perhaps we never truly develop a self capable of connecting with others. Schopenhauer would argue that this epidemic of emptiness reveals a profound truth. Most people don't actually know who they are because they've never had to find out. Their identity exists only in relation to external validation, achievement, or distraction. Remove these props, and there's no solid core, just an echoing emptiness they'll do anything to avoid hearing. A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, Schopenhauer insisted. If he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is really free. This connection between solitude and freedom isn't just philosophical, it's practical. Those who cannot bear their own company become hostages to distraction, prisoners of their own avoidance. But if boredom reveals such uncomfortable truths, is there any value in embracing it? Schopenhauer believed there was. For him, the capacity to be alone with oneself wasn't just a virtue, it was the foundation of authentic existence. Those who can face emptiness without flinching discover something remarkable on the other side, not just who they are, but who they might become. Historians note that many of humanity's greatest insights emerge not from frenetic activity, but from periods of forced inactivity. Newton developed his theory of gravity during a plague quarantine. Einstein's thought experiments occurred during quiet hours at the patent office. Shakespeare wrote King Lear while theatres were closed due to disease. Boredom doesn't just reveal who we are, it creates space for who we might become. Schopenhauer himself was no stranger to solitude. Often described as a pessimist and misanthrope, he nevertheless found in his isolation the freedom to develop one of history's most penetrating philosophical systems. Had he been constantly distracted, constantly entertained, would his insights have been possible? Almost certainly not. His discomfort with the world pushed him inward, where genuine discovery awaited. So what can we learn from Schopenhauer's understanding of boredom? How can we use this uncomfortable state as a mirror, rather than fleeing from its reflection? First, we must recognize boredom not as an enemy, but as a messenger. When that restless discomfort arises, instead of immediately reaching for distraction, we might ask, what is this feeling trying to tell me? What emptiness am I avoiding? What truth is trying to emerge in this silence? Second, we can practice intentional boredom, creating space in our lives where nothing happens and no distraction is available. This isn't meditation or mindfulness, though these practices help. It's simply the courage to be unproductive, unstimulated, and present with whatever arises. Third, we might reconsider our relationship with entertainment and technology. These aren't inherently problematic, but when they function primarily as escape hatches from ourselves, they become obstacles to self-knowledge. The question isn't whether we enjoy these things, but whether we can be okay without them. But there's another dimension to boredom that Schopenhauer highlighted, its connection to the will that drives all human life. For Schopenhauer, the will is the fundamental reality behind existence, an endless, restless striving that can never be permanently satisfied. When we experience boredom, we're actually confronting this will directly, seeing it stripped of its usual objects of desire. Most people find this confrontation unbearable because it forces them to recognize the futility of their endless wanting. They seek one thing after another, believing each new acquisition or experience will fulfill them, only to find emptiness waiting on the other side. This is why wealthy people are often no happier than the middle class, and why fame brings as much misery as joy. The problem isn't what we have or don't have, it's the endless wanting itself, which boredom forces us to confront. In his magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer describes human existence as a pendulum between pain and boredom. We either want what we don't have, causing pain, or temporarily satisfy our wants only to find emptiness, causing boredom. This insight explains why modern society's attempt to eliminate boredom is fundamentally misguided. No amount of entertainment can solve the underlying problem, because the problem isn't lack of stimulation, it's our relationship with desire itself. Some might argue that boredom is simply an evolutionary signal to seek more stimulating environments, a prod to exploration and novelty. But Schopenhauer saw it as something deeper, an accidental glimpse behind the veil of Maya, the illusion that keeps us trapped in endless striving. When we're bored, we momentarily see through the deception that the next thing will finally make us happy. We confront the emptiness that lies at the core of desire itself. This is precisely why it feels so uncomfortable, and precisely why most people will do almost anything to avoid it. Think about how society treats those who appear content with solitude and silence. The person who doesn't constantly seek entertainment is viewed with suspicion. What's wrong with them? People wonder. Why don't they need what everyone else needs? The contented introvert, the monk in meditation, the philosopher in contemplation, all threaten the collective delusion that happiness comes from constant stimulation. Their very existence suggests an alternative that most find too threatening to consider. Our educational system reflects this bias against inner depth. Schools reward external achievement and measurable productivity. Students learn how to perform tasks, memorize information, and produce results, but rarely how to cultivate rich inner lives or find meaning in stillness. The child who stares out the window in silent contemplation is scolded for not paying attention, while the one who busily completes worksheets is praised. We train young people to fear emptiness and equate worth with activity. The smartphone revolution has taken this avoidance to unprecedented levels. Studies show the average person checks their phone 96 times per day, once every 10 minutes of waking life. Each check delivers a small dopamine hit, a tiny escape from the present moment and whatever discomfort it might contain. But what's the cumulative effect of thousands of these micro-escapes? Research suggests it's a diminished capacity for sustained attention, reduced empathy, and increasing rates of anxiety and depression. The very tools we use to avoid boredom may be making us miserable. Some will object that boredom isn't profound, it's just unpleasant. But this objection misses the point. The discomfort of boredom isn't random, it's information. When we feel that restless emptiness, our minds are signaling something important about our relationship with existence itself. Avoiding this signal doesn't eliminate the underlying condition, it merely postpones the reckoning. It's like ignoring the check engine light in your car because you don't want to deal with the problem. Eventually, the avoidance itself becomes more costly than the original issue. This avoidance manifests in countless modern pathologies. Addiction, whether to substances, screens, or shopping, often begins as an attempt to escape the discomfort of being alone with one's thoughts. Workaholism functions similarly. Keeping busy becomes a strategy for avoiding the emptiness that might emerge in stillness. Even constant social activity can serve as a defense against self-confrontation. The person who can never be alone isn't independent. They're fleeing something within themselves. Schopenhauer believed that true contentment comes not from satisfying the will, but from momentarily escaping its endless demands. He saw three primary paths to this escape: aesthetic contemplation, losing oneself in art or beauty; ethical awareness, transcending self-interest through compassion; and ascetic renunciation, deliberately denying the will's demands. All three share a common feature. They require the ability to be present without constantly seeking the next thing. In other words, they demand the very capacity that boredom helps develop, the ability to exist beyond the cycle of desire and temporary satisfaction. This connection between boredom and transcendence appears across philosophical and spiritual traditions. Buddhism teaches meditation practices that deliberately induce states similar to boredom, training the mind to observe restlessness without immediately responding to it. Stoicism emphasizes the value of voluntary discomfort as a path to freedom. Even Christianity has its desert fathers, monks who sought enlightenment in the emptiness of solitude. What all these traditions recognize is that avoiding discomfort makes us weaker, not stronger. Our capacity for meaning grows precisely when we stop running from emptiness and learn to face it directly. The irony of our boredom avoidance culture is that in fleeing emptiness, we create lives that are, at their core, empty. The constant stimulation we pursue doesn't satisfy us. It merely distracts us from the fact that we remain unsatisfied. As Blaise Pascal observed centuries before Schopenhauer, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Nowhere is this more evident than in our relationship with technology. The devices that promise to connect us often leave us feeling more isolated. The platforms that claim to expand our worlds frequently narrow them through algorithms that feed us more of what we already know and like. The entertainment that was supposed to enrich our lives often impoverishes them by stealing the empty spaces where creativity and reflection might flourish. Schopenhauer would see this technological saturation not as progress, but as collectively organized escape, a massive infrastructure dedicated to helping us avoid ourselves. But what would happen if we stopped running? What might we discover if we allowed ourselves to be bored? The experience of artists, writers, and scientists suggests something powerful. Creativity requires empty space. The mind needs fallow periods, times when nothing is happening, for insights to emerge. We've all experienced this phenomenon, the solution that comes in the shower, the idea that arrives while walking, the clarity that emerges during a long drive. These insights don't materialize because we're working harder. They come precisely when we stop working and allow emptiness to exist. Neuroscience confirms this intuition. When we're not focused on specific tasks, the brain's default mode network activates, making connections between previously unrelated ideas and processing emotional experiences we haven't fully integrated. This network, essentially our brain in boredom mode, plays a crucial role in creativity, self-understanding, and meaning-making. When we constantly suppress it through stimulation, we literally prevent some of our most important neural processes from occurring. This explains why periodic disconnection from technology often leads to surprising experiences of relief, clarity, and renewed energy. What we're calling digital detox is really just allowing the mind to function as it was designed to, with periods of focused activity balanced by periods of unfocused integration. The mind, like any complex system, needs both activity and rest to operate optimally. Our culture's pathological fear of boredom disrupts this natural rhythm, keeping us in a state of perpetual low-grade stimulation that's ultimately exhausting. The result is millions of people who are simultaneously overstimulated and understimulated, bombarded with content but starved for meaning, connected to everyone but intimate with no one, constantly entertained but rarely delighted. Schopenhauer's insight about boredom as a mirror forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What are we actually running from when we avoid boredom? What would we have to face if we stopped distracting ourselves? For many, the answer involves confronting painful realities, relationships that don't work, careers that don't fulfill, values that haven't been examined, potentials that remain unexplored. No wonder we reach for our phones. It's far easier to scroll through social media than to ask whether we're living the lives we truly want. But this avoidance comes at a terrible cost. The person who cannot face emptiness becomes a stranger to themselves, living always on the surface of experience, never diving into its depths. They may accumulate achievements, possessions, or experiences, but these remain external acquisitions rather than integrated aspects of a meaningful life. To use Schopenhauer's terminology, they remain enslaved to the will rather than finding freedom beyond it. This enslavement isn't just philosophical, it's practical. The person who cannot tolerate boredom becomes manipulable, easily influenced by advertising, propaganda, and social pressure. Their discomfort with emptiness makes them vulnerable to anyone offering relief, whether through products, ideologies, or distractions. True independence requires the ability to sit with uncertainty, to tolerate discomfort without immediately seeking escape. Without this capacity, freedom becomes impossible. Schopenhauer believed that most people never develop this capacity. The majority of men are not capable of thinking, but only of believing, and are not accessible to reason, but only to authority. This harsh assessment reflects his observation that few people develop rich inner lives. Most remain trapped in conventions, assumptions, and habits they've never questioned, not because they lack intelligence, but because questioning requires confronting the emptiness that lies beyond familiar certainties. But Schopenhauer also offered hope. While he believed most people remain enslaved to the will's endless striving, he saw potential for transcendence through contemplative practices, compassionate action, and artistic experience. These don't eliminate boredom, but transform our relationship with it, allowing us to see it not as an enemy, but as a gateway to deeper understanding. This transformation begins with a simple but radical step, staying with boredom rather than fleeing from it. When that restless discomfort arises, instead of reaching for distraction, we might simply observe it with curiosity. What does it feel like in the body? What thoughts accompany it? What urges arise? This practice, essentially mindfulness applied to boredom, doesn't make the feeling pleasurable, but it makes it informative. We begin to see patterns in our avoidance, understanding better what we're actually running from. As we develop this capacity, something surprising often emerges. Boredom itself transforms. What initially feels like empty restlessness gradually reveals layers of experience, subtle emotions, forgotten memories, creative impulses, philosophical questions. The emptiness isn't actually empty. It's full of material we normally miss because we're too busy distracting ourselves from it. This is the great paradox of boredom. What seems like nothing to avoid is actually everything we need to explore. The very state we flee contains the seeds of the meaning we're seeking elsewhere. Schopenhauer understood this paradox. Despite his reputation for pessimism, his philosophy contains profound insight into how we might live more meaningful lives precisely by stopping our endless flight from emptiness. He saw that our desperate attempts to avoid boredom often create lives that are, at their core, boring, devoid of depth, authenticity, or genuine connection. The executive with the impressive resume but no inner life, the social media influencer with thousands of followers but no real friendships, the consumer surrounded by possessions but empty of purpose. These are the true casualties of boredom avoidance. They've succeeded in distracting themselves but failed in discovering themselves. The alternative isn't a life without entertainment or pleasure. It's a life where these experiences are chosen consciously rather than compulsively. It's the difference between turning on Netflix because you genuinely want to watch a particular show versus turning it on because you can't tolerate silence. It's checking social media because you're genuinely curious about a friend versus checking it because you can't bear an empty moment. Freedom doesn't mean never being entertained. It means not needing constant entertainment to feel okay. As Schopenhauer noted, the emptiness of existence finds its expression in the whole form existence assumes, in the infiniteness of time and space, contrasted with the finiteness of the individual in both, in the fleeting present as the sole form in which actuality exists. Put simply, our brief lives unfold in an infinite universe, and how we relate to the silent spaces between moments defines who we truly are. So the next time you feel that restless discomfort, that urge to reach for your phone, turn on the TV, or otherwise escape the present moment, pause. In that silent space between stimulus and response lies perhaps the most important question you can ask yourself. Who am I when nothing is happening? The answer might terrify you or liberate you, but either way, it will reveal the truth. Because Schopenhauer was right. Boredom doesn't just reveal your true self. It creates the conditions for discovering who you might become, if you had the courage to face the emptiness and find what lies beyond. Most will never take that journey. They'll die as strangers to themselves, having spent decades running from a confrontation that might have been their salvation. Will you be one of them? Or will you have the courage to be bored and discover who you really are?